Hello, I'm glad you've joined us today. We continue to study the Gospel of Mark. Today picking up in chapter 8 and verse 1 with the account of the feeding of the 4,000. In Mark chapter 8 verse 1 it says, "In those days when there was a great multitude and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples and said to them, I feel compassion for the multitude because they have remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their home, they'll faint on the way. And some of them come from a distance." And his disciples answered him, "Where will anyone be able to find enough to satisfy these men with bread here in a desolate place?" And he was asking them, "How many loaves do you have?" And they said, 7. And he directed them to the multitude to sit down on the ground. Taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks and broke them and started giving them to his disciples to serve them. And they served them to the multitude. And they also had a few small fish, and after he blessed them, he ordered these to be served as well. And they ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 7 large baskets full of what was left over of the pieces. And about 4,000 were there, and he sent them away. And immediately he entered the boat with his disciples and came to the district of Dalmanutha. The news of the healing of the deaf man that we studied about last time had led to a southern gathering of a multitude around Jesus, eager to hear his word, to see his power. And they've been following him now for 3 days. And what food that they had was running out, and they had nothing to eat. And as previously done with the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus has compassion on these people and miraculously multiplies a few loaves and fish to feed this multitude. Here it's 7 loaves and a few fish. And here the number that he feeds is 4,000. Matthew, again in his account, Matthew chapter 15 and verse 58, tells us that it was 4,000 men besides the women and the children. So this is still a great multitude of people who are being fed. And much like last time, there's a lot of leftovers. Here, they take up 7 large baskets of the leftover pieces. And as with the previous account, this miracle points to the fact that Jesus is sent from God. He shows his deity. It shows his ability to be able to provide all needs, not just for our physical needs, but our spiritual needs. This is what the miracle points to, the fact that he is the bread of life, and not only able to supply just enough for what we need, but as we see from the leftovers, it points to the fact that he abundantly supplies beyond what we need. But this incident is a little different than the 5,000, because the 5,000 that were fed earlier were primarily Jews. Here, these 4,000 are mostly Gentiles. And you remember the first miracle in this period of ministry began with a Syrophoenician woman there in the region of Tyre, and it was suggested that the crumbs of bread might fall from the table of the Jews to the needy Gentiles. And Jesus is showing that his blessings, again, is not just for the Jews, but for all men, for all nations. His own people had rejected him. As John said in his gospel, he came to his own and his own knew him not. They rejected him for the most part. And yet his blessings is not just for the descendants of Abraham, but for the whole world, for whom he would give his life. He would truly be the bread of life for all nations. As we talked about earlier, the promise to Abraham, his descendants, of course, would be the Jews. And from his descendants would come this one through whom all nations would be blessed. In Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3, through thy seed all nations would be blessed. And Jesus is that seed. Yes, he came from the Jews, but he would bring blessings to all men through the giving of the sacrifice of his life. And after this, immediately he entered the boat with his disciples, and they came to the district of Dalmanutha. And this place is also called Magdala. It's a place that's just a few miles north of the city of Tiberias on the western side of the Sea of Galilee there, the region of Gennesaret that we talked about earlier. Sometimes the Sea of Galilee is called the Sea of Tiberias. So this city's near there. And it's a place that's just directly east of Canaan as you look at the map. So we pick up in Mark chapter 8 and verse 11, and it says that the Pharisees came out and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, "Why does this generation seek for a sign? Truly I say unto you, no sign shall be given to this generation." And leaving them, he again embarked and went away to the other side. And they had forgotten to take bread, and not having more than a loaf in the boat with them, he was giving orders to them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And they began to discuss with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up?" And they said to him, 12. "And when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up?" And they said to him, 7. And he was saying to them, "Do you not yet understand?" Now, ever since Jesus had severely rebuked the Pharisees for their formalism and their hypocrisy, he'd been traveling now through the region of the Gentiles, through Gentile territory. But after feeding the 4,000 there in Decapolis, he had traveled back across the sea, and as soon as he comes back into the region there where it was mostly Jews, and on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, these Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, they come to attack him. They want him to work a sign from heaven, that they might test him, that they might trap him. He filled the whole land with wondrous signs from heaven, showing his power from many different forms, which plainly shows him to be the Messiah, the Son of God. And they want a sign from heaven. They're not really interested in a sign as to what it might point to. They just want to try to trap him. They're hypocritical, and their way of asking this is really just a means of throwing doubt and discredit on the miracles that Jesus had already performed. And Jesus, it says, sighed deeply in his spirit. This sigh comes, as we might say, from the very bottom of his heart. The Lord's human spirit was stirred to its depth as he sees the blindness and hypocrisy and hardness of these enemies who use all their efforts to just try to trap him and destroy him. They're not really interested in his truth that he's preaching or what his miracles point to, and they're just wanting a sign to try to trap him. And this it disturbs Jesus as he witnesses this, but he says he will not give such a sign for such a reason. He said, "Why does this generation seek for a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation." And leaving them, he embarked to go again to the other side of the sea. While they're crossing, him and his disciples are crossing back over the sea in the boat, Jesus uses this occasion to try to teach his disciples. That's about the only time that they've been able to have alone. You remember he had started going up through the Gentile region, the Tyre area and Sidon, and eventually comes over to the Decapolis, looking for a place of seclusion that they might be together, to have time to eat, to have time to be together. He needs to teach and train them and bring up their faith, to warn them and prepare them for what's to come. It's not going to be long before Jesus is going to be heading toward Jerusalem, and he will eventually be crucified and raised from the dead, is going to ascend into heaven. He has to prepare these men. And so as they go across, he's talking to them and trying to teach them and bring them up to a spiritual plane and warn them. And he tells them, watch out, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod. He's warning them of these men who are very religious. These Pharisees are very religious, and yet their religion, as Jesus already pointed out, their religion and their worship is in vain because they teach as doctrines the precepts of men and hold to the traditions of men over the Word of God. And so they too have rejected the teaching of the very Son of God, being too blind to see what his teaching and what his miracles pointed him to be. So he says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Leaven, or yeast, is a symbol of evil and corruption because just a small amount of yeast put in dough permeates the whole substance in which it's mixed. And Jesus is warning against the dangerous tendencies of formalism, of hypocrisy in religion that the Pharisees held to. He's warning against these teachers who claim to be religious and yet are spiritually blind. Many people were influenced by the Pharisees because of their hypocritical show of religion. And Jesus is warning them of that. He also warns of the leaven of Herod. This seems to be a warning against worldliness and irreligion. Herod professed to be among God's people. He professed to be a Jew, but he followed the customs and the practices of heathen religions. We today need to be warned against both. Both attitudes still exist today and influence people. There are those who are very religious, and yet much of what they teach and practice is not found anywhere in the Bible. And yet they're revered by men because they appear to be very religious people, wearing all different kind of names and following all kinds of doctrines of men. And then you've got people who claim to be among God's people and yet live like the world. We need those same warnings against such people. The disciples, they're just failing to understand anything Jesus is getting at. When he mentions leaven, they think he's talking about bread, literal bread. And the fact that they didn't bring anything with them but just a loaf of bread, they thought that maybe he was going to get on to them because they'd only had brought one loaf of bread with them, didn't have anything to eat to provide for them on this trip. Jesus, aware of this, of their discussion, he says, why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart, having eyes? Do you not see? Having ears? Do you not hear? He said. Jesus is continually trying to bring these disciples up to a different plane, to a spiritual plane, to increase their faith, to get them to think in spiritual terms, not always about the physical when he's talking to them and trying to teach them. He has so little time to teach and train and prepare them for what's to come. As we said, it's not going to be long before he's crucified and raised and will ascend into heaven. It's going to be these men who are going to be left here to do his work. And this has to be frustrating as they're not able to understand as they should be able to at this point. And Jesus trying to teach them these spiritual things they don't comprehend, they don't see, they don't hear. He says, do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves and for the 5,000, how many baskets of broken pieces did you pick up? And they said 12. And he said, when I broke 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets of leftovers did you pick up? And they said 7. And he says to them, do you not yet understand? He reminds them that on 2 other occasions, he'd miraculously provided for their physical needs and for the whole multitude. If they were lacking physical food, he could supply that. They should know that by now. And they're talking about, is he talking about the fact that we have no bread? Now, Jesus was concerned about their spiritual food. And he was thinking of what false teaching that they would encounter. And he's warning them about that, but they're not able to see that. We look at that and we say, how could they have been so dense? How could they not see and understand what he was talking about? But we as disciples can have the same problem, can't we? Many times we can be more concerned about the physical than the spiritual, can't we? Many times we act as though we're more concerned about food for the body than we are food for our souls. even though we have, as disciples, been with Jesus for so hard on these disciples, because in many ways it seems that we find ourselves hard to see and hard to understand, and to come up to the spiritual plane and thinking that God would have us to have on a daily basis. So in a way, we need this rebuke as much as these disciples did. A lot of things to consider. We'll stop there for our lesson today. We'll pick up here next time. Hoping you'll come back and study with us again. And until then, I hope you have a good day.